Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim Daf Zayin. Today's daf is sponsored by Neely Engelhardt on the occasion of Ayala Bab's Bat Mitzvah. Your strength in Torah, your heart of Chesed, the beautiful values you carry from your family are truly inspiring. May you continue to shine and grow in all you do. Mazal tov. Okay, the Rosh Hashanah dapim are up. Okay, you have to go a few pages back. If you go to catch up on the daf, you can find them. If you haven't found that yet on the new site, it's just in the menu under Daf Yomi. You can find catch up on the daf. It's a good, easy way to always just, if you're a few pages behind, you can get to where you're up to. So you'll see them there. Okay, Dapim 9 and 10. Once I teach Erev Rosh Hashanah Shiur, then I'll put it up in order the way it's supposed to be. Okay, we're going to get started today. So that's just if anyone wants to get ahead. Letting you do that a little out of order, but that's what there is to do. Okay. We started yesterday with this question, and we started in the middle of Vav Amud Aleph, and it goes all the way into the top of today's daf, which is this question, and I will disappoint you, but we're not going to actually end up with an answer to this question. So the question is, Korban Ola, we know atones for bitul mitzvat aseh, for positive commandments that I didn't do. And they wanted to know, what if I designate an animal and for the Korban Ola, and after the point that I designated, I missed a few more positive commandments or one, it doesn't matter. Will this cover it or not? So one of the sources they brought, the last one we were up to, I think they just brought two altogether, but the second one they brought was this Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says that the Seirei Atzeret, why do we bring these Seirei Atzeret on these two animals on Chag Shavuot? Once you bring one, what do you need the second one for? So they say the second one atones for sins between the first and the second, to which they say, right? What do you see there? It obviously works because we assume we designate them both at the same time. To which the Gemara said, well, you're right if they designate them both at the same time, but it must be that you designate them one after the other, and then this doesn't teach you anything because you really only designated the second one later, which means it doesn't teach you anything about once it was designated, to which they say, but how can you say that the Torah is specifically telling you that without it telling you that? In other words, it just says take two sirim. It doesn't say take them one after the other and only take the second one once you've done the first one. So that's a little bit of a hard answer, in which case we're back to saying this doesn't really provide an answer, right? If it's not one after the other, then it must be they were both at the same time, which actually would give us an answer. Okay, so we actually are at the point where it would be, but comes Rav Papa and says, what are you talking about? This doesn't prove anything. Because this is a public offering. Now, public offering, the Beit Din can make a stipulation about them. And the Beit Din can say, even though we're separating both these animals at the same time, really the second one's only going to have sanctity. Normally, a person takes an animal, it becomes immediately sanctified. But if it's the Beit Din doing it for a public offering, they can make this stipulation that it's not going to be sanctified from the beginning, but only when, right, sakin moshachto l'mashu, right, when you go to slaughter it, the knife basically designates it, okay? And then it's only designated at that point, which means what? That, right, we can actually say that this can provide a proof, because then this doesn't provide any proof. Sorry, I just got confused for a minute. This doesn't provide any proof because this animal wasn't designated, even if you say it was designated at the beginning, it wasn't sanctified at the time of designation because of this lay Beit Din. But the Gemara is going to say, how can you say that Rabbi Shimon holds? We'll start from 4 lines from the bottom of Vav Amabet. Umi leila Rabbi Shimon leiv Beit Din matnei alehem. This is all to explain Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Rabbi Shimon is the one who said these two Seirei Atzeret. What are they coming for? To atone on, right? The second one is coming to atone for any impurities that happened in the temple between the time of the first and the time of the second. Which then we had the whole thing to explain. And Rav Papa said in the end, theoretically, this could be a case where the designation only happens later, which means this doesn't provide any answer to our question because it's not a case where it was actually sanctified from the beginning. But they want to try to reject Rav Papa and say, but you can't possibly put those words, Alev Beit Din matnei alehem, into Rabbi Shimon's opinion. So Rabbi Shimon himself doesn't hold that way. How do we know? Because Ha'amar Rav Idi Barav and Amar Rav Amar, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, 4 rabbis was passed down, but in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Tmidim shelo hutzrachu litzibur. Okay, we have animals that were bought from the machatzira shekel, right? All the half shekels people brought. And then we have what's called tormei metalishka. They would take all the money and they would buy animals from it. And they would buy in advance for the year, or they would buy a few times a year for a chunk of months. Let's say they bought too many animals. Now the machatzira shekel has to be used for that year. So what if you have animals left from that year? Can you sacrifice them for the next year? Can you just roll them over for the next year? Well, L'divrei Rabbi Shimon ain nifdim tmimim. According to Rabbi Shimon, there's nothing you can do with them unless they have a blemish and they can't be offered. And then what do? You redeem them, you sell them, you take the money, and you can use that money now for, to buy sacrifices. But not if they don't have a blemish. L'divrei chachamim nifdim tmimim. Now, according to the rabbis, you can redeem them even if they're tmimim and use the money directly for sacrifices for the next year. Why is that? Because he says, Leiv biti maneh alehem, because it's really stipulated they're not really going to be sanctified until they're used actually. And therefore, he holds Leiv biti maneh alehem. But Rabbi Shimon doesn't allow it unless it gets a blemish. He obviously doesn't hold Leiv biti maneh alehem. He says they were consecrated from the very beginning. At the moment they separated them and designated them, there was sanctification. Now, if you hold Leiv biti maneh alehem, you wouldn't have to say that, and you wouldn't have to wait until they get a blemish and can't go on the altar anymore, and only then redeem them. So, what do you see here? That Rabbi Shimon, trying to explain Rabbi Shimon in that way that Rav Papa tried to explain, doesn't work. Which means that if there's no Leiv biti maneh alehem, where does that leave us? It means assuming, since the Torah didn't say you have to do a bezerach charzeh, one after the other one sacrifice, sounds like you designate them both at the beginning, and it covers sins Tumat Mikdash v'Kodeshav that happened between there and there, which would mean that you could prove our answer that it does work. Okay, that you can, right? Hafrasha after hafrasha, it could cover things that happen from then. But even though we resolved that, we have another problem. Okay, sorry, this is another problem. Sorry, this is a further problem on Rav Papa, which is going to again try to get us to an answer. Ha mine Rabbi Yirmeya mi Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Yirmeya asked Rabbi Zera the following question. Now, sire atzeret. Now, this is going to prove that we actually, again, can use this as an answer. Okay, why? Well, Rabbi Yirmeya asked Rabbi Zera a question. Now, what he asked him, okay, we're going to say we can derive from what he asked and what he didn't ask. Okay, because he asked it in this way and he didn't ask it in a different way, is going to prove that we actually can get to an answer from here. But then we're going to reject this one. He asked Rabbi Zera, sire atzeret, the same case, okay, our two goats for the Shavuot offering. Shekibel damam b'shnei kosot. If they were slaughtered at the same time, and the blood was collected in two different cups, right? Each one was slaughtered at the same time, collected the blood in the cup. V'nizrach damo shel rishon, and the blood is sprinkled of the first one. Sheni lama hubasa. What's the point of the second one? They're both slaughtered at the exact same moment. So he wants to know, al tuma she'irabin zrika shel zeh lezeh. In other words, can it atone for some impurity that happened between the sprinkling of the blood of the first to the sprinkling of the blood of the second? Now notice what he asks. Here he's asking about any mitzvah aseh that happened after the slaughtering. But he didn't even ask about the aseh before hafrasha, which would make it sound like we can actually have an answer to our question, because if he's asking a question about a later stage, it's obvious to him at the earlier stage. If it happened only after the animal was designated, and then you didn't do a mitzvah aseh, it would sound like this would atone for you, right? So, or in that case, it was the sirim, which are atoning for the tumat mikdash, and it would cover anything that happened between hafrasha to shchita. It's just a question, what about after shchita? Is that too late? Okay, that's his question. But the Gemara rejects this as a proof and says, Dilma imtim tzalomer kama. This could be a question that's asked like an imtim tzalomer, which is saying, it's a question building on a question. Maybe his question was really about hafrasha as well, from the time of designation. Would it cover? But, which then we wouldn't get to an answer to our question. And the question is, and if you want to say, that's imtim tzalomer, if you want to say that the answer is, it works, la'achar hafrasha, it can cover things that happen in between hafrasha to slaughtering. What about if it happened after the slaughtering? Would it cover that as well? So maybe it was a two-pronged question. And therefore, you can't necessarily learn from the fact that this is what he asked, because it doesn't necessarily prove what he didn't ask, that he had an obvious answer to that question. So in the end, we leave it kind of open because we do have some difficulties with trying to use this source as an answer to the question, and therefore, we don't really have an answer. Okay, moving on to the second sugya. We have 4 sugyot today, basically. One is, we finished up yesterday's sugya about this do we have an answer to this question about lachar frasha? Then we're going to move on to a machloka between Rava and Rav Chisda. From there, we're going to have 7 comments of Rava, 6 of them having to do with korbanot that were done some way, not lishma, not shinoi balim, shinoi kodesh, some sort of examples. 6 different laws, and a 7th having to do with the purpose of korban ola, like how an ola works. So the 7th one is a little bit different because all the others have to do with some incorrect intent. And then we're going to finally get to where do we get the Pesach and Chatat are exceptions to the rule that when they're done Shalom Lishma, they're disqualified. Okay, those are our 4 parts for today. So now we're up to part 2. Itmar. Toda sheshachta l'shem todat chavero. Sounds like a classic shinoi balim, but it's not. Okay, it's not for possible reasons. Number 1, we learned that shinoi balim is when you slaughter or catch the blood or collect the blood or walk the blood. But they all only have to do with if while I'm slaughtering, I think that I'm doing it for someone else to get atonement for the sprinkling of the blood. Okay, the thought has to be about the sprinkling of the blood, even though it could happen in any one of the 4 avodot. We saw that earlier. Right? We saw that, I think, in Friday's daf and daf dalid. So, sorry, daf hey. This seems to be that you slaughtered it for the sake of thinking that you were slaughtering someone else's korban toda. So it's not that you're thinking about the zrika, which would definitely make it shinoi ba'alim. And because of that, they're going to call this a type of shinoi kodesh, because another issue here is that we have a case where 2 people have to bring a korban toda, and you basically, while you're slaughtering it, let's say the Kohen says, okay, remember we said there's this debate about who exactly has the intent here. Is it the owner who's having the wrong intent while the slaughtering is going on by somebody else, or is it the person who's slaughtering it? Okay, which could be a Kohen, could be anyone. It could be the owner is the slaughterer. It could be someone else, though, because remember, the slaughtering is kosher for anybody. But the point is that while they're slaughtering it, they're thinking that they're slaughtering someone else's korban. So it's not a classic case of shinoi balim because there's no issue of the zrika. And also they say this is for the korban toda of someone else. So it's kind of like a shinoi kodesh. But it's not exactly because why? Well, it's more similar to a case where we had this already. Let's say I sinned and I ate chelev, and then I have to bring a chatat, a sin offering. But while they're slaughtering it, they think that they're bringing the sin offering for chatat dam, for eating blood and not chelev. Okay? In other words, it's a different type of chatat. Here it's a different type of toda. It's not exactly right, but both are chatats in that case, just the thought was chelev as opposed to dam, or dam instead of chelev, whichever. And here we have toda for Reuven instead of toda l'Shimon, or toda for Rud instead of toda for Nomi. Okay? We have a mixed up owner, but it is the same korban. So that's why it puts it in a bit of a strange place. And like I said, it's not shinoi balim because it wasn't about the zrika they were thinking about. So, toda sheshachta l'shem todat chavero, Rabba amar kshera, Rav Chisda amar psula. So because it's a little confusing, right, we have 2 different opinions here where it goes. Now we're going to see why. Rabba amar kshera, toda l'shem toda nishcheta, because in the end, it was slaughtered for a toda. So what's the difference if it's the wrong person's toda? It's still in a toda category, so it works. Rav Chisda amar psula. Now you have to get rid of the word nishchata here. Okay, I'm going with the Bach's reading because otherwise it's hard to read the sentence. L'shum shlamim didei be'inan. It needs to be for the sake of this person's shlamim. Can't remember, toda is a type of shlamim, so they're using shlamim as a general term here. You have to bring the korban for the sake of the person who is being brought for. Okay, it basically says, fine, maybe we can't call it shinoi balim because of the zrika issue, because it wasn't chashiv zrika, but basically it was done for the wrong person, so it's definitely the wrong kind of korban, and it's disqualified. So now I'm a Rabba min Aminala. Rabba wants to bring a proof for his approach, but we're going to see he's not going to be so successful. It's going to be a little bit of one of these complicated inferences that we're going to kind of throw things in a bunch of different directions. We can infer this, we can infer that, we can infer it this way. Okay, but in the end, we're going to say, forget about any inferences. This actually just means what it simply sounds like. Okay, we're going to go back to a sugya we saw already. We're going to do this a lot today because a lot of the comments of the next section of Rava are also things we've seen before, which is helpful because I know we're in the middle or the beginning of this Masechet, which is quite complicated, a lot of new terminology, a lot of new ideas. So it's good when they repeat things, then we get it much better. Okay, and if you're feeling like a little like you're swimming in this and there's a lot of new concepts, don't worry. Over time, we have a very long Masechet, okay, I don't remember, 120, something like that. Dapim, 119. So anyway, we have a while, and don't worry, you'll get the gist of things as we go on. So this is just, I always say it's like watching the beginning of a movie when you have no idea what's happening yet and you don't understand yet, and you're, what? Who's that? And what's that? Or you're reading a book and there's so many characters and you can't keep track. Eventually, when you get into it, you start understanding. So anyway, what happens? Rab is going to bring a proof from the following Braita. Like I said, we saw this already on Daf Dalid. Ditanya. Ubisal zevach todat shlamav b'yom krivo et zivcho. Okay, so there's a bunch of extra words here. It's the meat of the zevach, which is really the sacrifice or the thing that will be slaughtered, of the toda of his shlamim, okay, on the day he sacrifices. Now, okay, we're not going to read the rest of that, but it's not important. Why does it say todat shlamav, the toda of his shlamim? Because it says zevach, which means to slaughter. The toda of his shlamim, it means if you sacrifice your toda as shlamim, right? Go zevach, toda, shlamim. If you sacrifice your toda as a shlamim, it's kshera. Why is that? We learned because we'll see it again inside, but a toda is a type of shlamim offering. But shlamim shenishchatu l'shem toda psulim. But if you sacrifice a shlamim for the sake of a toda, that's not good because the set of shlamim includes other things that are not necessarily a toda. So that's already going to be Shiur Kodesh. Umay fresh pain selazeh. Why is there this difference? As I explained already, toda kriya shlamim. A toda is called shlamim, but every toda is a shlamim. But ein shlamim kriyim toda. Not every shlamim is a toda. Okay, that's what it's teaching us. It's very simple, straightforward. But they're going to try some very complicated, convoluted diukim, inferences. Well, what can you infer here? Notice what it says is disqualified. A shlamim l'shem toda is psula. Okay, a shlamim for the sake, if you take a shlamim, you do it for the sake of toda, it doesn't work. Ha toda l'shem toda would be kshera. But that would infer only a shlamim in the name of a toda. But if you did a toda in the name of a toda, and then you'd have to say my lav dechav, right? Even if it's, now here's where it gets tricky. We assumed we were talking about a toda in the name of a shlamim for that same person. But what they're going to say is perhaps it's talking about, right? In other, it didn't say toda l'shem toda would be a problem, which means toda l'shem toda, even if it's for somebody else, would be okay. So they say, what are you talking about? Lo, D-Day. That can't infer any of that because this subject of this braita is when you're doing it for the sake of the same person and all you're changing is the name of the korban. And you're trying to infer from there something about two different people. For sure, that's not what it's talking about. So they reject Rabba's proof. But Rabba comes back with a retort and says, well, okay, aval dechavre mai psula, you want to say, if you do a toda in the name of your friend's toda, it's going to be disqualified. That's what he's saying to Rav Chisda, which is Rav Chisda's approach. Well, then this braita doesn't make sense either because that's a much bigger chiddush, that a toda in the name of a toda is disqualified, in which case, atone shlamim l'shem toda psula. Why would he give a case then of a disqualification of a shlamim in the name of a toda? Lini toda l'shem toda. Say if you do a toda in the name of a toda of someone else, it will be disqualified. V'koshakate, and then you'd be able to derive from there. Obviously, then if you do a shlamim l'shem toda, it will be disqualified. Now, obviously, they're mixing and matching two different things because toda l'shem toda is different owner, and shlamim l'shem toda is same owner, and that's in the end what they're going to say. Okay, but Rab is trying to say, according to you, it should have brought a bigger chiddush. Toda l'shem toda, even that could be disqualified, which would mean obviously a shlamim l'shem toda would also be disqualified. To which they say no. Shlamim l'shem toda d-day it's derichale. Okay, what they're basically, the inferences are kind of a little bit absurd because they're not really sticking to what it's really trying to say, and that's what they're basically going to conclude in the end. You can't really infer any of what you're trying to infer from here, Rabbi, because this braita had a totally different subject matter in mind. This wasn't talking about different owners at all. This was talking about same owner, but switching from a toda to a shlamim, taking a toda and saying it's a shlamim. That's what it needed to teach you, because salkadat achamina, midatoda kriya shlamim, shlamim nami kriyim toda. You might have thought, since a toda could be called shlamim, you might think a shlamim could be called toda. So if you took a shlamim and you did l'shem toda, maybe it would be okay. And if you slaughtered it l'shem toda, maybe it would be okay. Kamash malan, that needs to teach you that it's not. And that's why this needs to teach you specifically shlamim and toda, and not having anything to do with toda for somebody else, a toda in the name of a toda. So basically, Rabba's proof, in a very convoluted way, right? His attempted proof, which was very convoluted and didn't really stick with the simple reading of that Braita, but kind of just taking words out of context and saying, oh, Shalom L'Shem Toda, then Toda L'Shem Toda, even though it was talking about something different, about different owners, and they weren't really comparable, and therefore the Gemara completely rejects his proof. So we had a machloket, Rabba and Rav Chisda here, about a Toda L'Shem Todat Chaviro. Is it kasher? Is it pasul? We have two opinions. Each one explained their opinion, and then Rabba tried to bring a proof for his opinion, but his proof is completely rejected. Third section for today are 7 halachot of Rabba, 6 out of the 7 having to do with kavanah, messed up intent in doing a korban. So some of these are going to be complete review. What's interesting about the review, though, is I'll just point out a small thing, which is the first two came up on Daf Gimel. And there, though, it was in the name of Rav. Now, you could see why Rav and Rava get confused, because in manuscripts, they would often just write Rav, like Resh Bet, sometimes with a chupchik, with a little, like apostrophe there, which would mean short for Rava or Rabba or something like that. But theoretically, maybe the chupchik would get ignored and it was Rav. So some people actually changed the gears on the earlier pages to be Rava, because it does seem here like these are all said by Rava, and that maybe it was a mistake that they had it by Rav in the other page. But anyway, that's a very side point. Amar Rava, chatat sheshachata l'shem chatat kshera, l'shem ola psula. We have a sin offering that was slaughtered for the sake of a sin offering, like even if it's a different one, it's kshera. But if it's l'shem ola psula, and that's what we call Shiur Kodesh, it was done for the sake of the wrong korban completely, right? Chatat in the name of an ola. What did we learn? That a chatat is disqualified. My time, what's the reason? V'shachat ota lechatat, amar Rachmana, v'rei chatat l'shem chatat nishchata, l'shem ola psula. It says there, you slaughter it as a chatat. So it doesn't matter if it was chatat chelev or chatat dam. It was done for the sake of chatat. That's fine. But if it's done for the sake of something else, it's disqualified. And we'll come back to that at the end of today's daf when we see that that's the source for. Do it for the wrong korban, it's completely disqualified, because you have to slaughter this one, otad, this one, as a chatat, not as anything else. V'amar Rava, second one. Chatat sheshachata al mi shemechuyav chatat psula, al mi shemechuyav ola kshera. Now this is shinoi baalim. Now we learned this already about shinoi baalim. If you slaughter it for a different person who's also chayav a sin offering, that's actually disqualified. We'll see why in a minute, even though we learned this already, we'll see it again. But if you slaughter it with a different owner and a different korban, in other words, we slaughtered it for someone who was chayav a completely different korban, it's actually kshera. Why is that? My time. V'chiper alav says, and it atones for him. Now, what do they learn from him? Alav v'lo chavero. That's what we learned. It has to be slaughtered for him and not for someone else. But you have to add one thing. Why for an ola is it not a problem? Well, chavero dumya didei b'mechuyav kapara k'moto. In order for it to be disqualified as a shinoi baalim, it needs to have, it was done for someone who's actually obligated the exact same korban as you. You have to be on equal footing here. So if it's slaughtered for someone with a completely different korban and for a different person, that's already so distant that it's actually not going to even function as a disqualification. So while in order to say lishma disqualifies, right, lo lishma disqualifies, it has to be a different korban for shinoi kodesh, but dafka for shinoi baalim, since you're changing one thing, right, once you change two things, different owner and different korban, that's already too distant, and that's not going to even count as a disqualification. Okay, right? It has to be somewhat similar, that it's someone who's obligated the same type of korban, and then you switch the owner, that's going to disqualify. V'amar Rava, Rava says, right? Sometimes you can maybe come up with a logic here, right? That it's so distant that it's not even disqualified. To disqualify, it has to be a little bit off, but not completely off. But sometimes you could say it's not really so logical, but they're just deriving these things from the verses, okay? So if it's not sitting well with you, the concept here, well, they're just deriving it from verses. V'amarav, chatan shechata misha eno mechuyav klum psula. Okay, this is a new one. If you slaughter for someone who's not obligated any korban, okay, so what's that? Now you might think that's completely distant. They're not even chayav a korban, and it wouldn't even be shinoi baalim. But Rav is going to say something unique here. It's actually disqualified because slaughtering for someone who's not chayav anything at all is actually like slaughtering it for someone who's obligated a sin offering. Now, that's a weird thing to say. Sin offerings are very specific, and they cover specific sins. So if someone didn't sin, they're not obligated a sin offering. So how could you say that it's like they're obligated a sin offering? Well, Rava has this unique approach here to say the she'en lecha adam b'Yisrael she'eno mechuyav aseh. There's no one who didn't. Everyone in the world has sometimes not done mitzvot. Okay, there's definitely positive mitzvot that we've all missed opportunities for, and therefore, now this is a very weird therefore. What covers mitzvot aseh that you don't do? Right, someone who just doesn't fulfill positive commands, an ola. So that would be a shinoi ba'alim for an ola, which would actually be kshera. But what he's going to say in this next line, this fourth din of Rava, ve'amar Rava, chatat mechaper l'chai ve'aseh mikal v'chomer. He says that even though a sin offering is very specific, you did a specific sin like eating blood, which you're not allowed to eat, and you get karet for it if you did it intentionally, you did it unintentionally, right? You bring a korban. Well, comes Rav and he says, achai ve'kritu mechaperet, if chatat atones for something severe like I did something that I'm really obligated karet for, but since I did it unwillingly, I won't get karet, but I bring a chata for it. Won't it also cover? We're now going to learn that even though a sin offering is for something specific, once I'm bringing a sin offering, it covers all sorts of other things as well. If I didn't do mitzvot aseh, it would cover those as well. So that's why if you slaughter your korban chatat in the name of someone else, it actually is not a shinoi ba'alim, okay, to atone for someone else, remember, to sprinkle the blood for someone else, who isn't obligated any sort of offering. It's like they're chayav achata because everyone theoretically is chayav achata because everyone theoretically does mitzvah aseh. There's mitzvah aseh they haven't done. And since the chata covers serious things, it must cover lighter things as well. It must atone for that as well. It's a big chiddush because who said that? Now the Gemara says, wait a minute, lememer debat minahu. Wait a minute, you're debat minahi. You're trying to say that this is a person who is mevatel mitzvah aseh. It is obligated the same thing as a chatat, right? It's like a chatat. It's the same type because remember, shinoi ba'alim only disqualifies if it's the same type, and this is disqualified because they call it the same type. But Ha'amar Rava, didn't Rava say, the other statement of his, Chachat, that we read already, someone who's chayav an ola is the one who didn't, right? Someone who didn't do mitzvot aseh is actually obligated in ola offering. So how could you say they're obligated a chatat, even if a chatat, let's say, maybe atones for it, but they're really chayav an ola, and that makes them it's an owner, right? It's a different korban, which wouldn't be disqualified. So turning now to Amabed, the answer is something we actually used previous stuff to answer this. I think it was yesterday's. There's a mild type of, really, bitul mitzvah aseh is someone who's chayiv and ola. But a chatat also weakly covers them. Weakly, like weak, chalash, weak, weak. Okay? It covers it in a some sort of manner. Because it covers it in some sort of manner, we can consider someone who's not obligated to korban at all, but they must have not done some mitzvot aseh, that it's enough to call this the same type. Since a chatat would somewhat cover this, again, it's weird to explain exactly because it covers it in a weak manner. We don't know what that means exactly, but it's enough to cover it to basically call this a chatat and a chatat, okay? A chatat for someone else. And therefore, we're basically going to say that this is considered bat mina. It's the same type to be able to say the shinoi ba'alim disqualification kicks in. Fifth halach of Rava. Va'amar Rava, ola shashachta shelo lishma, asur lizrok dama shelo lishma. This we saw already on Daf Bet. Ibai de makra, ibai de masfara. And they're just going to very minorly reference the pasuk. We had to prove this on the Sfara to prove this. Okay, what's this halacha? If I slaughter an ola for the wrong intent, so I slaughter it as a shlamim, let's say, and then I say, oh, I already messed up on the slaughter, maybe I'll just continue this as a shlamim. No, you can't do that, okay? You have to go back to what its original trajectory was. It was originally intended for an ola. You have to go back and do not go back. You have to go for all your next actions you're going to do, catching the blood, bringing it to the altar, sprinkling the blood. All of that has to be done for the sake of the korban. Don't think, oh, I already messed it up. I could do it any way I want. Now we can learn this either from a pasuk or from logic. And again, as I said, the Gemara is just going to quote like a few words from the sugya there. If you remember what that means is, I'll review. That's the pasuk that talked about keep to what you said you're going to do. And then it says neder, and then it switches to nedava, and then we say, what does this teach you? Oh, this is a reference to lo lishma, where something that was one thing turns into something else. And then they say, but a nedava obviously has to be brought the way it was supposed to be brought. So we have to do it the original way. The second option is svara, which is mishum deshane ba what, and then it says kideresh pirka, go back and see in the beginning of the chapter, even though we still feel like we're at the beginning of the chapter, that was really at the beginning of the chapter. So the logic there is just because you change and you mess something up doesn't mean you can continually mess things up, right? Obviously, go back and fix what you did and do it the right way. Ve'amar Rava, sixth halacha, last one about some sort of mess up in the intent. Ola haba la'achal mita, shachata b'shinoi kodesh psula, b'shinoi ba'alim kshira, de'ein ba'alim la'achar mita. If someone dies, we had this, let's say, with the yoledet, the woman who was giving birth, and then she died and her sons are supposed to bring, or her heirs, could be girls if she has no boys, no sons, they're supposed to bring her korban for her. Now, if when they bring that korban, let's say she had an ola left, right? The chatat, remember, they don't bring in her place. But let's say, right, she was supposed to bring an ola and a chatat. By the way, I mentioned I can't remember now if I mentioned this in class, but there's two possibilities. There's one that she brings an animal and a bird, okay, one for an ola, one for a sin offering, or she brings two birds, one for an ola, one for a chatat, right? One for an ola, one for a sin offering. There's two options. It depends how wealthy she is, if she can afford an animal. Anyway, what happens is they then take on themselves her ola if she hasn't offered it. Now, if when that ola is sacrificed, they do it b'shina kodesh, they do it as a shlamim, let's say, just disqualified. But if they do it b'shina, right, it would be meaning it would mess up, right? It wouldn't work l'shem chovah, right? Because it's not a chatat, so it's not completely disqualified. But the shino kodesh messes it up. Shinoi baalim, though, doesn't matter. Let's say while they're slaughtering it, they think about that they're doing it as atonement for somebody else. Okay? Doesn't do anything. It's not a problem at all. Why? De'ein baalim la'achar mita, because this is like an unowned sacrifice. Nobody owns it, right? We saw this before. That's the whole thing. Do the heirs acquire it or do they not acquire it? Okay. Now, Rav Pinchas bereid Rav Ami Amal yesh baalim la'achar mita. If you remember, we quoted this opinion as well. He has a different approach. He says there are baalim la'achar mita. The heirs actually become the owners of it. So Amarle Rav Ashi. So basically, this one, what Rava says is a machloket about. Rava says there's no owners after death. And therefore, there's no shino bali, because you can't say you messed up on the owner when there is no actual owner. The kids are just bringing it in her place, but she's dead, so she's not the owner, and they're not really the owner. Rav Pinchas has this unique approach, and the son of Rabbi Ami, he says there is ownership after death. The heirs become the owner. So Rav Ashi says to Rav Pinchas bereid Rav Ami, Davka kamar mar yesh baalim la'achar mita? Do you really mean it completely they own it? In which case, the question is, Baila tuye ola achrite. That's if it's done incorrectly or if something goes wrong with it. Are they completely the owner that they have to then bring their own korban ola separately? They have to go buy another animal if something happens to it? Are they really the owner? Like they completely become the owner? Or does it just mean that they own it enough that it will atone for some sins they have, like mitzvah aseh they didn't fulfill? So what type of ownership are you talking about? Complete ownership, that they have complete responsibility over this? Something happens to the ola, they have to bring a new one? Or do you just mean that it atones for some of their sins, any aseh they didn't do, but not that they really are the owners? To which Amarle, Rav Pinchas answers him, Dafka Kamina. No, I mean, they really own it completely. And then assume responsibility. It's as if they're now the mother who has the obligation. They come in as the new owners of the korban. So we have these two different approaches here about whether there's baalim la'achar mita or not. And this wouldn't be only in a case of a woman giving birth. It would be anyone who has an animal designated, leaves it to their children. Okay, seventh one. This is the perfect one for Rosh Hashanah. Okay, we're heading into Rosh Hashanah. It's good to always have things that connect. Va'amarava, ola doronhi. The ola is just a gift to God. It doesn't really atone. Now, what have we been saying all along? The ola atones for sins, positive commandments that I didn't do. But now we're going to learn that it's really just a gift. Hechidami, what's the case here? What are we talking about? Well, idaleka tshuva, if you didn't do repentance at all, you didn't do a mitzvah aseh, okay, let's say you didn't say kriyat shema, just I'm picking an example, and, or, you didn't hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, but you didn't care, you didn't do any repentance about it, and then you brought this korban ola, well, zevach rishayim toeva, okay, the sacrifices of wicked people is despicable, okay? God doesn't accept sacrifices of people that don't do tshuva. You can't just do tshuva, right? The whole echtav ashuv, right? It's very important to be getting to this in the beginning of our Masechet. Korbanot don't cover you in a way that you don't have to do anything, okay? It just doesn't work that way. You obviously have to do atonement. V'idi ika tshuva. Now, let's say you do atonement. And here really comes the first statement was how important it is to do tshuva. The second statement is how powerful tshuva is. Because Hatanya, it says in a Braita, aval amitzvat aseh v'shav. If you don't do a positive commandment, okay, this might be different from a negative, okay? If you don't do a positive commandment, v'shav, and then you repent, you feel terrible that you missed shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Lo zaz misham ad shemochalin lo. You don't even have to move from there. You get atonement. Okay, you're covered. You're pardoned. Immediately. That's how powerful tshuva is, at least for mitzvot aseh that you don't keep. So therefore, you don't need the korban ola. What does it do? It doesn't provide atonement. You've already gotten atonement when you did tshuva. If you don't do tshuva, it can't give you atonement because you didn't do tshuva. If you did repent, then it was accepted right away. So what's the point of the ola then? It must be a gift to God. In other words, what's the idea of a gift to God? You're thanking God for having provided you with atonement. Okay? For God allowing you this process that you could do tshuva and God will accept. And then you have to thank God for that. You have to be appreciative. Okay, these next words are actually just a siman. Siman. So we're not going to read them, but it's a siman for what's coming here. For this braita, Tanya namihach, here's a braita to support this idea. Amar Rabbi Shimon, chatat lama ba'a. What do you bring a chatat for? So the Gemara says, lama ba'a, lechaper. Okay, everybody knows why you bring the chatat. The chatat is to atone for a sin that you did. Ella, no, what they meant to say is lama ba'a lifnei ola. When you have this pair of birds, chatat and ola, you always bring the chatat first. Why does it come first? Well, it's for this reason. Lepraklit shenichnas, it's missing the word mashal. It's a parable for. Okay, here's a parable that will help you understand it. A praklit shenichnas, so you have someone who's coming to go to the king and plead on behalf of someone who did something wrong to the king. Ritza praklit, nichnas doron acharav. If the praklit succeeds in getting the atonement, then he brings a gift after to the king to thank him for it. So that's exactly what's going on here. First, you bring a sin offering to atone for your sins. After that, you bring an ola to thank God for having accepted your chata. Now, this is a little different because this is talking about a chata for a negative commandment, but it's the same idea. That the ola that's coming after the chata is a thanks offering, right? It's not a toda, that's something else, but it's basically thanking God for accepting your atonement, for giving you atonement. So it comes after the chatat in that case, and in a case of mitzvah aseh that I didn't do, first stage is I do tshuva, I'm immediately atoned for. Then I go to God and I bring him this gift. So that's a nice idea about the value of tshuva and how powerful really it is. And how necessary, right? It's number one, necessary. Number two, very powerful that you can get immediate repentance. Okay, immediate atonement. Now we're going to get to the last part of today's stuff. Chutz min pesach v'chatat. So now we want to know, why are those the only two that if you do them shelo lishma, they're disqualified? Pesach minalan. So this could be a little bit complicated because we're going to have to go through a few rounds to get it right. So there's some psukim about Pesach. First of all, there's a lot of them in Shmot. We're going to quote one of them. And there's also psukim and Dvarim about it. And we're going to quote some from there and some from there. So we're starting with Dvarim. Shamol et Chodesh Ha'aviv v'asita Pesach. And you should keep the Chodesh Ha'aviv. That's the month that Pesach comes out in the spring. Someone pointed out this morning, first day of fall today. So that's the one of spring. V'asita Pesach. And you should do the Pesach. What does that mean? Asita Pesach. Yiyu kol asiotav l'shem Pesach. All your actions should be l'shem Pesach, meaning all your 4 avodot, here you have it, 4 avodot have to be done l'shem Pesach. And we don't yet have that it's going to be disqualified. First, you have to do it. So eshkachan shinoi kodesh. So that teaches you shinoi kodesh. I want you to be very clear here. That's shinoi kodesh for all 4 avodot because it says asiotav. But shinoi baalim minal, and where do you get shinoi baalim from? Tichtiv va'amartem zevach pesachu. This we know from the Haggadah. It's quoted a lot. This is pasuk from Shemot. Now there it says zevach. Zevach is slaughtering. So this one's only going to teach you about slaughtering. We're going to get back to that later. Where do you get the other 3 avodot? But tehei zvicha l'shem Pesach. From here you learn the zvicha has to be in the name of Pesach. Now, we already learned Shinoi Kodesh from the other pasuk. So ime no inyan l'shinoi Kodesh, ne inyan l'shinoi Baalim. We've done this a lot of times already. Since it's not teaching you about Shinoi Kodesh because we already know that, so it must be teaching you about switching the owner, right? If it's done for the wrong owner, also. Eshkachan l'mitzvah. Okay, so this is all just that you're supposed to do it for the right reasons, just like we have by shlamim. Slaughter it for the sake of shlamim. Slaughter it, right? That's all the mitzvah. It doesn't teach you it's going to be disqualified. Well, la'akev minalan. How do you know it's disqualified? Third pasuk they're going to quote back to the one in Dvarim. This is the next pasuk there. Amarkra vizav, or maybe it's the same. No, it's a different pasuk there. Vizavachta pesach la'Hashem Elokecha. You should slaughter the Pesach to God. Here you have the same idea a second time, right? Shana alav katuv la'akev. Okay, it doesn't say that in the Gemara, but they figure you know this already. Once something appears twice, it's telling you it's essential, meaning you don't do it, it's disqualified. But matkiv la Rav Safra, wait, that pasuk v'zavachta is definitely not coming for this because it's coming for something else. So that third pasuk that was teaching you la'akev, I'm knocking out. Why? You need it for the drasha of Rav Nachman. To Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabbi Ravua, he says, how do you know that if you have leftover Pesach, meaning you had an animal designated, but you didn't use it for some reason, and now it's left, and it's after Pesach, and you have nothing to do with it, what do you do with it? You do it as a shlamim, because a Pesach is a type of shlamim offering. How do you know that? Now, there's something very weird about that pasuk. You should slaughter the Pesach to God, tzon, sheep, right, that category of animals, and bakar, and cattle. Now, Korban Pesach isn't cattle. It's fasim or izim. It's sheep or goats or lambs. It doesn't come from the cattle. Right? That's like cows and oxen. It doesn't come from bulls. Minayin lemotar Pesach. Mikan. They learn from here. Lemotar Pesach. Lidaval haba min atzonu min bakar. The tzonu bakar is coming to teach you. It can come as a shlamim. Because a shlamim can be either tzonu bakar. So it's saying if you have a Pesach left over, v'zavachta Pesach, sometimes you can slaughter a Pesach. It's not the simple reading of the pasuk. Sometimes you can slaughter a Pesach for something that could theoretically be brought as from bakar, which is a shlamim offering. And that's if it's left over, right? Maini, what is that? Shlamim, which can be brought from the tzon and from the bakar. So you can't use that pasuk for that. So, El Amar Rav Safra, so let's go back. Rav Safra says, v'zavachta Pesach, Kid Rav Nachman. That's not for our purposes. That's for that halacha we just said about the motar Pesach. Now we're back to figuring out how do we know it's disqualified. So he's going to have Shamor et Chodesh Aviv lemitzvah b'shinoi kodesh. Amartim zevach Pesach b'shinoi baalim lemitzvah. That's the same as we had before. One is teaching you shinoi kodesh, one is teaching you shinoi baalim, because it can't be teaching you shinoi kodesh. Okay, we got that. Where do we get la'akev? Hu la'akev. Ben hacha v'hacha. When it says Amartim zevach Pesach, who means it has to be done in its way. It's done it right, and that's a repetition, because we already had it from the other psukim. The who comes to reference both the Shinoi Kodesh and the Shinoi Baalim. It's like a repeat, and therefore it's la'akev. It must be done in this way, no other way. If you don't do it this way, it's disqualified. Okay, now, what's missing though? Eshkachan zvicha. Now, when it comes to the Shinoi Kodesh, remember the asiotav, all 4 avodot. When it comes to the Shinoi Baalim, though, the pasuk is zavachta, which is zevach. Zevach Pesach is slaughtering only. So eshkachan zvicha sharvadot minalan ho'il v'gale gale. So the first answer is, since they revealed by Shinoi Kodesh it was everything, so also by Shinoi Baalim it'll be everything. But Rav Ashi doesn't accept that. Rav Ashi amar ho'il v'gale gale lo amrina. We don't say that, and therefore el avodot minalan. Where does he get it from? And he's going to have a whole different way of learning it. Okay, it's going to be the opposite order. The repetition is going to be the 2 psukim we saw. But the first pasuk he's going to have that teaches you the main halacha before we get to the repetition is a different pasuk entirely, but one that we're familiar with. Zot haTorah la'olah u'lemincha, etc. And it says shlamim there. Now it doesn't say Pesach there, But the next pasuk of Vitanya, there's a brighter that says the next pasuk, B'yom Savatot B'nei Yisrael Akriv et Korbanehem. What are the korbanehem? What other sacrifices? So in the next pasuk, which is close enough to still do a juxtaposition, mentions Pesach, again, not explicitly, but implicitly. So now we have the comparison to shlamim. Ma shlamim ben shinoi kodesh ben shinoi baalim be'inan lemitzvah. Av kol ben shinoi kodesh ben shinoi baalim lemitzvah. So we learn from shlamim, because that was where the main halacha of lishma was learned. That was all of daf dalid. What's the source for that in all four avodot? So we learn all four avodot for Shinoi Kodesh and Shinoi Baalin from the Shlamim, and then that includes everything. That's what we're going to say now. Kishlamim, Ma Shlamim bein Zvicha bein Shar Avodot lo chilakta b'hem lemitzvah. So now there we don't distinguish between Zvicha and all the other avodot. Remember, we had a whole thing about how we learn all the four avodot there. Now we have to make one jump that the Gemara doesn't tell us, but what they're doing here is Av Pesach lo tachlok bo bein b'Zvicha bein l'Shar Avodot la'akev. Then if we add to the Pesach, the other two psukim we already saw, one Shinoi Kodesh, one Shinoi Baalim, you now have a repetition, because we have it in the Pesach with the Shlamim, and then we have it again. So therefore it's La'akev, and since we're comparing it to Shlamim, it must be in all four avodot, everything. And that covers everything according to Rav Ashi. There's one question left for Rav Ashi, Elahu Lamali. So what do we do with the who in Amartim Zevach Pesach? You don't need that anymore. The who in the first reading was La'akev, but we don't need that anymore. So what do we do with that? Keditanya uses it for something else, which is related. Ne'amar b'Pesach hu b'shchita la'akev, right? The who there is telling you, no, it's in the same pasuk of la'akev. We don't need the who to tell you that it's necessary and essential. But what it's there to teach you is who and not something else. Against Rabbi Eliezer, if you remember. Aval asham lo ne'amar bohu elalach alachar taradi murim. The who in this pasuk is said with the slaughtering. The who in the Asham Pasuk is said in the part that's not important, the burning the parts on the altar, which you could do without, to teach you who atzmosha lo ukturim murav kasher, right? And even if you don't do the aktarani murim, it's kasher. Therefore, it's to teach you that the Asham is not disqualified if you did it shalol lishma. The who in the Pesach is say, who in Shchita it's mentioned, that has to be done and there's no other way around it. But the Asham, it's coming to exclude the Asham, like I said, against Rabbi Eliezer, because he thinks an Asham lo lishma is actually disqualified. But according to this reading, it's the mainstream opinion. Only the Pesach is disqualified. But shalol lishma, and we'll end with this one pasuk about the chatat. Chatat minal, and how do we know a chatat is disqualified? D'chtivish chat ota lechatat, sheteish shchita l'shem chatat. So it has to be slaughtered lechatat. It has to be done lechatat. If it's not done lechatat, it's no good. That's how they get it from there. We'll continue on with the chatat in tomorrow's daf. So we had the four sections today. One was finishing up that question, which we end up really not without a clear cut. We end up without a clear cut answer for if an ola was designated and then you did some other, didn't do mitzvot aseh, positive commandments, will it cover them from after the designation? We don't have an answer. We had a machloket about a toda, sheshachta l'shem toda chavero, was slaughtered to be slaughtered as his friend's toda instead of his, or instead of hers. Would that work? Machloket Rabbi and Rav Chisda. Rabbi tried to bring a proof, but we rejected it. Then we had 7 halachot of Rava, 6 of them having to do with issues of shalol lishma, different halachot, he said. Some of them were more complicated to understand than others, like, for example, the one where we had to ask all these questions about that the chatat sheshachta l'shem, someone who's not chayav anything is actually psula, because it's like a chatat, even though it's really more like an ola. How do we explain that? Well, we explain the chatat somewhat atones for these mitzvot aseh also in a weak kind of manner, but that's enough to say it's the same type, and therefore it would be a shinoi balim. Anyway, we had the 6th and then the 7th about the ola being a gift to God and not really atoning, even though we thought before it was atoning. And then we had this psukim about Pesach and Chatat. From where do we learn that they are actually disqualified if they're done shalol lishma? And it took us a little while to get to the Pesach, but in the end we learned it, just to review the answer, from the Shlamim pasuk. That teaches you the base halacha, that it's a mitzvah to do it. And all 4 avodot, because the first proof didn't really teach the shinoi balim in all 4 avodot, so we had to try a different attempt. Once we have that in all 4 avodot, both shinoi balim and shinoi kodesh, then we have the 2 psukim we used earlier for Pesach to say, oh, that teaches you shinoi balim and that teaches you shinoi kodesh, and because it repeats it, it's la'akev. It's essential, and without that, it's disqualified. And then the chatat, we had the v'shachat tal lechatat, special drasha on that pasuk that teaches the chatat is disqualified if it's not done exactly for a chatat offering. With that, we finish for today. Like I said, we'll pick up with the chatat tomorrow, and wishing everyone a good day. So there is regular shiur tomorrow, Erev Rosh Hashanah, and as I said before, the shiurim for Rosh Hashanah are already up on the site. If you go to the catch up on the daf section, you'll see it just like I think it's up on Friday's date. You'll see it there. And Monday, it'll go up all in order. Wishing everyone a good day.